Well, this morning we're going to see some additional miracles in the book of Acts, starting with the healing of a crippled man. And you know, when you read through Acts and you read of these miracles, it has to beg the question, what about healing today? What about miracles today? And in these healings, when you look in the Gospels and look in Acts, when healings and miracles occurred, they glorified God and they turned people to the Lord. And so we've got to be thinking, well, why doesn't God do that today? Why doesn't he still act that way today? He does. I want to share with you a story this morning that we received just this week. Many of you know that we have been in a partnership with FAM, for All Mankind movement, working in India for over 5 years now. Well, not we. I can't get into India. I've been blackballed. Pastor Jason leads the teams into India, but we've been there a little over 5 years now, and just this last spring, Kevin and Brooke, the founders of FAM, were on a trip in Pradesh area of India. They took their daughters with them. Their middle daughter, Bella, you remember how old, is she like 14 or 15 maybe? Bella is not really comfortable in that culture. She doesn't like the food. It's just a place that's way out of her comfort zone. But I want you to listen to what Brooke wrote about what happened with Bella on this trip just a few months ago. Typically in India, in the evenings, you're doing large meetings with anywhere from 100, 150 people or more there. But during the day, you just go from home to home to home to home, praying for people, sharing biblical stories with people. So that's what they were doing. And this was on their last day. The afternoon air was hot and thick as we walked up to the home. We were all exhausted, but the father invited us into the home. Inside, the room was dark. It smelled like sweat and smoke, and the walls were covered with idols and pictures of Hindu gods. We sat down with the family. They told us they had a daughter who was 15, but she had been fully crippled since birth. She could not walk, move, or even talk. Nothing her family had tried helped her to get better. The family brought the girl into the room and sat her on the floor in front of us. As soon as she came in, Bella turned to me and said, "Mom, I have to pray for this girl." "Of course," I said, "we're going to pray for them." "No, Mom, I have to pray for her." And so we shared a Bible story with the family, and then my two daughters laid hands on this girl's crippled body and began to pray. Bella went first and prayed with more passion and intensity than I'd ever seen in her before. They prayed that this little girl would be healed, that she would come to know Jesus, she'd be set free from the bondage of these Hindu idols all over the room. When we finally looked up after praying, everyone in the room was weeping, even Kevin and the local pastor, but the girl was still on the floor crippled. As we prepared to leave, our daughters prayed one last time for the girl. We still saw no change in her. When we left, Bella, with tears in her eyes, asked me, "When do you think we will find out this girl is healed?" "I don't know," I said. "She may never be healed this side of heaven, but she will be healed spiritually if she comes to know Jesus." "Yes, I know," she said. "But when will they tell us that she has been healed?" We left India that day, and the girls eventually went back into the rhythm and routine in Houston. 5 months later, Kevin was doing a leader training with our state leaders in India. The leader from Pradesh came to him and said, "KP, do you remember that girl that your family prayed for?" We prayed for hundreds of girls that week, but KP knew immediately who he was talking about. "Yes, I remember very well," he said. "Brother, this girl is healed." The leader went on to share how after the mission team left, the family began attending a FAM story group to learn more about this Jesus and have all become followers of Christ. During this time, the girl who was crippled since birth had been completely healed, and she is now running, jumping, laughing, and talking. "Her feet, her hands now are all the proper way," he said. "The family has taken all the idols from their home and thrown them away. Their home has become a house church, and the father is a strong leader. This is only God's work." Well, healing certainly still happen today. God heals to bring glory to himself. God heals to demonstrate the power of the gospel, typically for those who've not heard or experienced the gospel, but whose hearts are very open and there's a willingness to believe. You know, Jesus, Scripture tells us, didn't do many miracles around Nazareth because of the strong, stubborn unbelief. And I wonder sometimes if that's not why in our nation we don't see more miracles. God does still perform miracles. God heals when it suits His purposes, when it fits His purposes. We have to trust Him. And I want to say this morning, because I know there's several in our body that are in need of a miraculous healing. If you need a healing or you know someone who needs a healing, yes, you should pray for that, but also pray that God is glorified and that people are drawn to Jesus, that Jesus is known. We have to remember that we're His creation. That means He can do with us as He sees fit. You remember, He's the potter and we're the clay. And so we have to ask the question, what am I willing for Him to do? Am I willing to let Him do as He wishes with me? God still moves and God still heals, but it's according to His plan and His purpose. All right, we're in the book of Acts. Last week in chapter 9, we looked at the beginning of Paul's ministry. Paul immediately, once those scales were removed from his eyes, he received the Spirit, he was baptized, he immediately began preaching the very thing that he arrested Christians for blasphemy, and that was he began preaching that Jesus was indeed the Son of God. We know that he spent significant time, there was about a 3-year period there, we don't know how much of that, but significant time in Arabia, being taught by the Lord, not seeking men, not looking to the apostles, not receiving instruction from men, but being taught, being instructed by the Lord, and he boldly proclaimed the gospel. And when Paul did that, Scripture tells us that people were amazed. What were they amazed about? A complete and total transformation that they saw in Paul. And so people were amazed, but the leaders also wanted to kill him. Why? Because the gospel then and today as well goes against the world's thought and the world's system. It's completely contrary. And so the leaders wanted to kill Paul. The main thing I want to point out that you see throughout Acts in the life of Paul is his obedience to the Spirit. He is completely controlled by the Spirit. He follows the Spirit's lead in everything he does. In every action he takes, you see the Spirit is leading and guiding in that. One final word from last week was simply the reminder of the value of one. You never know when you lead someone to Christ the impact that may have on many. I'm sure when Ananias went to Paul as the Spirit had instructed him to do, even though God told him that Paul was a chosen instrument of the Lord, he probably had no idea the impact that Paul was going to have because Ananias was willing to go to him. Well, picking up where we left off last week, we're in chapter 9. We're bringing Peter back onto the scene. You remember that Peter is a main actor or main player in the launch of the church. He was there preaching on the day of Pentecost. He preached before crowds in the temple. God is using Peter to heal. God is using Peter to perform miracles that authenticate the gospel just as he did through Jesus in exactly the same way. And the latter half of Acts, once we get past about chapter 12, the latter half of Acts is going to focus mainly on Paul. Paul has been now introduced. Paul is the one who's going to bring the gospel rapidly advance the gospel to the Gentiles. But before that happens, Peter's the one who's going to open the door for that to take place. You see, Peter was God's chosen instrument to build the church. In Matthew 16:18, after Peter makes his confession, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God," Jesus goes on to tell him in Matthew 16:18 that he is being given the keys to the kingdom of heaven. In other words, Peter was going to have significant authority in the building of the church. And as you look through where we've been so far, Peter's one who's leading out with each phase of the gospel expansion. He preached at Pentecost. He preached in Jerusalem. That led to the expansion of the church in Jerusalem and Judea. He went to Samaria. The Samaritans had come to faith because of the work of Philip, but they didn't receive the Holy Spirit until Peter arrived and laid hands on them. And we're going to see in Acts chapter 10, he brings the gospel to Cornelius. He brings the gospel to the Gentiles. So he's the one who unlocks that last door, tears down that last barrier to the expansion of the gospel to the ends of the earth. And Paul's going to come in and build on this. Well, the latter half of chapter 9 is going to tell us what's been happening with Peter while we've been engrossed in Paul's story. Look with me in chapter 9, Acts chapter 9, starting in verse 32 and reading through the end of the chapter. Now, as Peter went here and there among them all, he came down also to the saints who lived at Lydda. There he found a man named Aeneas, bedridden for 8 years, who was paralyzed. And Peter said to him, "Aeneas, Jesus Christ heals you. Rise and make your bed." And immediately he rose, and all the residents of Lydda and Sharon saw him, and they turned to the Lord. Now there was in Joppa a disciple named Tabitha, which translated means Dorcas. She was full of good works and acts of charity. In those days she became ill and died, and when they had washed her, they laid her in an upper room. Since Lydda was near Joppa, the disciples, hearing that Peter was there, sent 2 men to him, urging him, "Please come to us without delay." So Peter rose and went with them, and when he arrived, they took him to the upper room. All the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing tunics and other garments that Dorcas had made while she was still with them. But Peter put them all outside, knelt down and prayed, and turning to the body, he said, "Tabitha, arise." And she opened her eyes, and when she saw Peter, she sat up. And he gave her his hand and raised her up. Then calling the saints and widows, he presented her alive. And it became known throughout all of Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. And he stayed in Joppa for many days with one Simon, a tanner. So Paul has gone back to Tarsus. Peter has been traveling all around the country. He's moving everywhere. The Christians, by this point, are not just in Jerusalem. They're scattered about because of the persecution, and Peter, like them, is traveling everywhere. What is he doing? He's teaching, maybe in small groups in homes. He's preaching. He's winning people to the Lord. He's encouraging believers. He's building up believers. He's building the foundation of the church. Now remember, Peter was a key leader in the launch of the church. We saw at Pentecost when he preached, 3,000 were added that day. In Acts chapter 2, we saw that the Lord was adding to the church daily those who are being saved. Acts chapter 3, he heals the crippled man in the temple, the crippled beggar, and he preaches to the crowd that are in the temple courts. Acts 4 tells us there are now about 5,000 men, just men. We don't know how many women added to that, about 5,000 that were part of the Jerusalem church. Now, Peter could have said, when everyone else was going about and scattering the gospel message, he could have said, well, I need to stay here in Jerusalem. I've got to watch over this church. I've got to give direction to this church. But Peter didn't do that. He went out just as others did. He didn't stay at home base. Peter was following the example that Jesus set. In Matthew 9, as Jesus is here on earth doing his earthly ministry, it's about halfway through that 3-year span of his earthly ministry, and he's getting ready. The disciples have, this first, let's say, year and a half, been watching him do ministry and observing him and learning from him when they would pull away and he would teach them. Well, he's about at the point of sending them out to do ministry and handing the ministry off. And in that passage in Matthew 9, down around verse 35, it describes what Jesus had been doing, that the disciples had been watching. It says he went through all the towns and villages, teaching, preaching in the synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom. So Peter's simply doing what he saw Jesus doing, going through all the towns and villages, going to places big and small, anywhere that there were people who needed to hear the message of the gospel. That's where Peter was, and that's where he was going. You see, Peter didn't see himself as the big gun, the one that was responsible for the big gatherings and the large crowds. He was involved in personal ministry to individual people. That's what he was doing in this setting, not just preaching to the large crowds. He was out there in contact with individual people. Peter knew he couldn't just minister from the platform or from the stage up front. If he was going to minister effectively, he had learned from Jesus to be a high-touch shepherd, to be involved in individual lives, to be willing to get out there and touch lives, to not just speak about a loving God, but for people to feel the touch of a loving God. And that's what Peter's doing here in chapter 9. He's not only following the example of Jesus, he's also setting an example for all of us who are followers in how we're to do ministry. This past Sunday night, I was preaching at Mercy Church, our church plant over in Southwest Little Rock. It was their Constitution service. You'll be glad to know that Mercy Church, this last Sunday night, actually constituted as a church. They are no longer a church plant. They are recognized by our Arkansas Baptist State Convention as an independent body, as a church. And not many church plants make it that far, and very few make it to that point as fast as they did. But we're excited and grateful for the partnership we've had with them and for the leadership of their pastor, Scotty Long, and the relationship we have with him. But as I was speaking to them, I was talking about their role in the community and the importance of getting involved in the lives and the needs of people around them. And I reminded them that there is one thing that is probably a greater impediment to the gospel ministry than anything else, and that's this. Y'all can't see this in the back, I suppose, but you guys in the front can see this. What is this? It's a garage door opener. That's the greatest impediment in my mind to the gospel ministry. As followers of Christ, as Christians who have a ministry, who are called to minister to the people around us, if we're not careful and remember our calling, when we come home at the end of the day, a couple of quick pushes of this button pushes the opportunities for ministry out of our lives. You know what I'm talking about. You come down the street, and when you're close enough, you hit the button, and you pull in, and you pull your car in the garage, and you hit the button, and you're done. We're supposed to be out and about and around people. We're supposed to be involved in their lives, meeting their needs, pointing them to their ultimate need. 2 summers ago, we did a series called The Art of Neighboring, which is probably something we should repeat. But God has planted each one of us in a place where there are people who have need. He's put us there to minister to the people around us. Listen, it can be difficult. I understand that. Donovan Sims, she's usually sitting right up here. Y'all know Donovan, right? And you guys in the venue, Tyler Nelson, those guys are my neighbors. It can be really difficult to be a good neighbor, okay? If you know those guys, you know and you understand that. Now, I know, let me just say to you guys in the venue, I know Tyler, he's going to be demanding a rebuttal, so here's what we're going to do. At 1 o'clock today, we won't live stream, but 1 o'clock, live right here, Tyler can give his rebuttal to what I just said, okay? It can be difficult. Listen, truth be told, I'm probably not the best neighbor. I'm quiet. I'm kind of an introvert, a bit of a loner. Fortunately, God gave me a woman who balances me out in a lot of ways. You should pray for her. I'm out of balance a lot. But Luann is the perfect neighbor. When it comes to neighboring, she gets it. It helps that her gift is hospitality. It helps that she's an otter, always looking for the next party and a chance to meet new people and to do things for people. To be in a position of ministry, we have to get out there. That's what Peter was doing. You know, a lot of believers sit around and say, well, I don't know exactly what I'm supposed to do. I'm waiting on God to show me. Can I take a principle of physics and relate it to the Christian life? Here we go. You ready? An object at rest tends to stay at rest. An object in motion tends to stay in motion. We have to get out there. If God is going to use us in ministry, which is what we're designed for, that's where we find true purpose and fulfillment in life. If He's going to use us in ministry, we got to get out there. We got to get around our neighbors and our coworkers. And I'm not saying that you should run out ahead of God. I'm not saying that at all. You need to listen and to follow the direction of the Spirit. He's going to direct you, but you got to get off the sideline and out on the field. You have to act like you want to be in the game. I've watched it upward. And it's funny sometimes when the coach is ready to put a sub in, you can tell some kids, they're tired or they're too busy kicking at the grass or smelling the flowers. They don't want to get in the game. They make it real clear. I think some of us make it real clear to God, we don't really want to be in the game. Listen, you have to get out on the field and get in the game. It's a lot easier to steer an object that's moving, that's in motion, to direct an object in motion, than it is to start an object that's standing still. When God gets ready to do something, He doesn't look on the shelves. God doesn't look up on the shelf and say, well, there's Dave. He's getting kind of rusty and dusty. Maybe I need to brush him off and put him to work. That's not what He looks for. He looks for people that are already involved and already in ministry and are in the flow. So you got to get in the flow. Wherever you are, you got to start there and get out there. And when you're moving, God is going to bring you up against ministry constantly. And let me tell you what's going to happen. God's going to bring some ministry your way, and you're going to look at that and say, I don't have what it takes. You're exactly right. I can assure you when God brings ministry your way, you don't have what it takes to get that ministry done. But God will equip you and God will empower you. And then your faith is going to grow, and you're going to look for more to do, and you're going to look for bigger tasks because it will be so exciting and so fulfilling that God is using you in ministry. So here in chapter 9 and 10, Peter participates in 3 miracles: the healing of a body, the raising of a dead, and the salvation of a lost person. Now, make no mistake, the greatest miracle of the three is the salvation of the lost person. That miracle was purchased at the greatest price, and it produced the greatest result of all the other miracles. And I say that to say, if you're here this morning or you're listening this morning, you're looking for a miracle, Maybe it's a healing, maybe it's a relationship miracle, maybe it's a financial miracle. If you don't get what you're praying for, you need to remember that as a child of God, you've already received the greatest miracle that will outlast any other miracle in your salvation. All right, we've gotten through half of verse 32. I'm going to have to save the third miracle till next week. Let's look quickly at the first two miracles here in chapter 9. Peter's on the move. He goes to the saints at Lydda. There are believers there. The gospel probably had come there during the persecution when the believers scattered. Philip had likely been there, but there Peter encounters a man named Aeneas. We don't know his age. We don't know if he's a Jew or a Greek. It's just made clear. It's told us here that he's been crippled for 8 years. Peter goes in and very simply says, Jesus Christ heals you. You know, as you read through Acts, there were throngs of people that would follow Peter or even try to bring their people out on the sides of the road where his shadow would fall on them. He became a great celebrity, but Peter made it clear the power was in Christ. So he says, Jesus Christ heals you, and then he tells him to get up, and immediately Aeneas gets up and he's completely healed. And the scripture tells us Aeneas' healing brought many to Christ. Not the entire population of the town, but it says everyone in Lydda and Sharon who saw him turned to the Lord. Why? The change in this man was undeniable. Everybody could see it. Listen, the power of the gospel is undeniable. Now, we don't know what happens in the time frame between verses 34 and 35. Peter did a lot more in Lydda than just heal Aeneas. He evangelized as he did everywhere he went. He taught, he encouraged the believers. Why? Because that was his calling. You remember that when Jesus restored Peter, he asked him 3 times, do you love me? You remember when he restored Peter, he said 3 words to him, feed my sheep. And so that's what Peter was busy doing. Somewhere between 34 and 35, as Peter is doing all that, word comes to him. You see in verses 36 through 43, the second miracle, word comes to him that Dorcas, or Tabitha, she was also called, a very, very faithful believer there at the church in Joppa, who was greatly needed by the church. She did a lot of work in that church, and specifically, she carried on a ministry to the widows, especially to the poor widows who didn't have enough, who needed help. And that is the work of the church. We are to care for those who are in need. And that's what this woman did. And as she was caring for those in need, we find out that she has died. Now, typically, in Israel, in that part of the world, when someone died, they were buried within 24 hours because there was no embalming. But we read here that they washed her body and then they put her in an upper room. Again, very unusual. Why would you carry the body all the way up there if on the same day you're going to have to carry the body down and out to bury? But they put her in this upper room, and that was an incredible demonstration of their faith in the risen Christ. Yes, she was dead, but what do? They send for Peter. They send for the man of God. They send for him in faith. Peter is a busy man. He's doing a lot of things, but he comes immediately. Why? Because he's available as the Spirit leads. That's how ministry happens. No matter how busy we are, we don't crowd God out of our day. We always leave margin. Peter's busy, but he immediately comes. And you see when he gets there in the upper room, all the women are there, and they're showing him the things that Dorcas or Tabitha has made for them, and they're weeping. Peter sends all the weeping women out of the room. Now, I'm sure there's some spiritual reason for that, but I think every man in the room understands sending all the weeping women out. That must have been a mess, right? He sends them all out. He prays. He calls her to get up, and she does. And verse 42 says that this became known all over Joppa, and many people believed. Now listen, Peter did not heal Dorcas for her own benefit. Where does someone go? Where does a believer go after they die? They don't have any desire to come back. Many of you who've lost loved ones this last year, and we've wept together over that, and we've rejoiced and celebrated over their life. Listen, as much as your loved one, if they are a follower of Christ, as much as they love you and love your family and love being here with you, they would never choose to come back once they've gone to be with the Lord. Peter didn't heal her for her own benefit. Again, God was working to bring glory and to bring honor to himself, and God was working to bring light to the gospel. That's what the healings and that's what the miracles were all about. Does God still do that today? Absolutely. We saw an example of that at the very beginning of our time together today. He may not do that for me. He may not do that for you. That's his choice. He does it to bring honor and glory to himself and to bring light to the gospel. Well, let me land the plane this morning. Let me just tell you three things that I think are very clear in this passage, 3 points or applications that we need to remember. The first is simply this: Peter was available to do ministry. The first key thing for us is to think about our availability to the Lord. Peter was busy. He had a lot going on. He was the leader of this church in Jerusalem. He was traveling all over the country, but he was always ready to go when God called. Whenever the Spirit spoke, however the Spirit led, Peter followed. That's why he had such incredible opportunities of ministry. The second thing is likened to it, and that is this: Peter was already out there. He was in the flow. God didn't have to pry him out of his recliner or pull him away from his favorite television program. Peter was already out. He was out with people. He was involved with people. He was already doing ministry. It was very easy for God to move him from place to place. Then finally, what we just saw in the passage and what we saw when he healed Aeneas is that Peter was dependent on the power of prayer. He made it clear that God was the healer. He was simply the servant, simply the vessel. Could God heal someone through me or you? Absolutely. If he chose to, he could do that. Could God use us to cause something miraculous to happen? Absolutely, he could do that. But we have to remember it's God's deal. He does it to bring honor and glory to himself, and we're simply vessels. We may never see, in this lifetime, we may never see the full impact of the ministry that God calls us to. We simply have to be faithful and trust him with the results. We got to get out there. We got to get on the field. We got to act like we want to be in the game. We have to make ourselves available so that God can use us to bring glory to himself and to bring light to the gospel.